Absolutely. We would love for everyone who's here right now to come back this evening and join us for the rest of the conference. Because, again, we're going to have dinner. Does anyone know when the dinner is? 5:15. That's right. I was the one who came up with the schedule. I don't even remember it. 5:15. That's right. I was just testing you guys to see if you knew. All right. Today, as you guys know, throughout Pastor Keith's sabbatical, we've been going through a series, and the series has been kind of comparing different reactions. You had the reaction of the nobleman who, or the royal official, who his son was sick and he wanted Jesus to come to him, and then you had the Roman centurion, or at least a centurion, I don't know if he was Roman, who had enough faith that said, Jesus, you don't even have to come to my house to heal this person. And then later on, we talked about when Jesus, when he calmed the storm versus when he walked on the storm. And I considered continuing that series, but today is, of course, a special day. Every day is a special day, I suppose. But with the missions conference, I wanted to focus on something that was missions-oriented. And I was trying to think about what biblical story can I talk about that would fit a missions theme? And of course, the whole Bible is missions themed, this idea that God wants to save the whole world. But I was thinking of three different people, and those three different people, I would consider them to be missionaries in the Bible, but they're very different. And they all have kind of different messages, but they all have something in common. So I'm curious if you guys can guess, based on even just the pictures, who I'm talking about. Who do you think is in this story? Jonah, right? The reluctant missionary. What about this story? Daniel, right? The willing. And then what about this story? This one's probably going to be a little more difficult. Jesus, right? And the woman at the well. And he was the pursuing. And I just thought, I was thinking of each of these different missionaries, and I thought, which one should I focus on? And I thought, why not all three? You know? So I hope you guys packed your lunch. No, I'm just kidding. It'll still be pretty quick. I'm not going to be able to do as much of an expository preaching as I usually do, where I focus on like 6 or 7 verses and we just talk about that story. I'm going to have to do a lot more summarizing, because the book of Daniel is many chapters. The book of Jonah is several chapters. The woman at the well is only 1 chapter, but it's lots of verses. So we're going to have to do a lot more summarizing today, but we'll still talk about some of the verses. Today, the goal is to show that every Christian should seek to pursue God's will and missions based on these 3 examples. God still used a reluctant Jonah. God still used a willing Daniel. And, of course, God still used the pursuing Jesus. So I thought about all these missionaries, and I thought, Jonah, he didn't want to be a missionary. Daniel, it wasn't his choice, but he accepted it. And Jesus was actively pursuing it. And I thought, they're so different, but yet God used each and every one of them regardless of their participation in it. All right, so God still used a reluctant Jonah. So Jonah, the first time we hear about him is actually, I believe it's in 1st or 2nd Kings, and it's this Jonah, I believe his name, he's the son of Amittai, and he's actually a prophet to the northern nation of God's people, which is called Israel. You remember, the nation of Israel actually split into 2 nations. There was a southern nation that took on the name Judah, because that was the biggest tribe that it had, so it just kept the name Judah. And then there was the northern nation, which kept the name Israel, because it had like 10 out of the 12 tribes, so that made sense. Israel to the north, just a terrible nation, never had a good king. The closest they came to it was still a terrible king. But Jonah was called to be a prophet to Israel. Now, that was kind of a difficult job. You guys know the story of Elijah and Elisha. You have like Ahab and Jezebel, and they're all trying to kill these prophets. So it was a pretty dangerous job to be a prophet in a wicked nation. But Jonah had a very unique message from God. God had realized that his people, Israel, were going to perish. They were on a downhill trajectory, and eventually they were going to destroy themselves. And he says, if I don't intervene, they're going to destroy themselves. So God decides, I'm going to intervene, and I'm actually going to help them prosper. Even though the king at the time, I believe it was Jeroboam II, he was still a wicked king, doing wicked things, worshiping false gods. God decided, I'm still going to let them prosper so that they can survive. Not because they were great, but because we serve a great God. And when he did that, he didn't just let them think that it was because of their own prosperity, right? It wasn't credited to the king. It wasn't credited to the people. God said, Jonah, I want you to go to the people and tell them, I am the one letting you prosper, so that everyone knows it's from God. So Jonah actually got to preach mercy to the nation of to a wicked nation of Israel, which is a very rare thing, by the way. Certainly prophets would go and preach about mercy, but they would preach about judgment that was coming unless they repented, and then God would provide mercy. But Jonah was given a very special task to preach mercy and prosperity to a wicked nation simply for God's grace that was given to Israel. So Jonah was a prophet to the nation of Israel, the northern nation. And God then called Jonah to go preach to another people group, the Assyrians. Now, the Assyrians were this empire, right? They were the enemies of Israel. When we think of empires, we usually think of Rome or Greece or even Babylon. But Assyria, at one point, owned Babylon. So Assyria was a very dominating nation. In fact, when you get to King Ahab, and it's not recorded necessarily in the Bible, but history tells us that King Ahab, he had to gather 5 other armies of other nations with him to try to fight back Assyria. And he even asked Judah to help him, and Judah wouldn't help him, and it caused tension between Israel and Judah. But God had... or this empire of Assyria was growing and growing, and it was the enemy of Israel, and it was and oftentimes overcoming Israel. And God says to Jonah, I want you to go to a major city in Assyria, which is called Nineveh, and I want you to preach a message to them. Now, Jonah, who's probably used to preaching a message of mercy, is like, no way, Jose, right? He's like, I'm not going to preach God's word to Nineveh. And it doesn't explain exactly why he chose not to, but later on we can kind of speculate based on what he says in chapter 4. But it says, but Jonah rose up to flee unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. Now, Assyria would have been to the east. Tarshish would have been to the west. So he's going in the opposite direction, not just to flee from Nineveh, but to flee from the presence of the Lord. And you think, Jonah's not dumb, right? He knows you can't actually flee from God. But he wanted to be so far away from Israel, so far away from God's people that no one could try to convict him, no one could try to bring him back to do God's will. He just tried to flee as far as he could. And he went down to Joppa, which is a kind of a port on the coast of Israel, and he found a ship going to Tarshish, so he paid the fare thereof. The Hebrew here, it talks a little bit about, or it implies the sense that he rented the boat, he rented the ship, almost as though he went to this cargo vessel and he said, hey, can I catch a ride? They said, we're not a passenger vessel. And he says, listen, I'll rent the whole boat, just get me out of here, right? He was desperate to get out of going where God had told him to go. And he went down into it to go with them unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. Now, you can imagine this is not what God wanted Jonah to do. He was doing the opposite of what God had asked him to do. And the Bible, especially in Jonah chapter 1 and Jonah chapter 2, it uses a lot of vivid imagery, especially in Jonah 2, it uses a lot of poetic language. But it talks about God taking the wind, almost taking it in his hand, and throwing it at the sea, right? To cause this major storm to disrupt the sea because Jonah was trying to flee from his presence via boat. So God disrupts his rebellion, and all the sailors on this ship, these experienced sailors, they realize something's going on. They realize that this is something supernatural. The gods are doing this, they believe. So they start calling out to their gods, because these are not Hebrews, right? These are not people who worship the God of Abraham. In fact, many of the Hebrews didn't even worship the God of Abraham. These were pagans who worshiped other gods, but even they understood this is a divine storm, right? There's something supernatural about this. And they cry out to their gods, praying, hoping that they'll save him or that they can appease whoever's doing this to them. And they wake up Jonah and they say, arise, pray to your God, right? Maybe he'll save us, not knowing that it was that God who had sent the storm, not knowing that Jonah was the reason for the storm. And they're begging Jonah to pray to the God who he's rebelling against. And Jonah, eventually he gets up, and they don't know what's going on, so they decide to cast lots. It's kind of like rolling dice, right? It's this idea of it's a game of chance, and they believe that the gods could kind of intervene and make it to where if you're thinking of dice, where the dice would land on the right spot. And that's how they thought the gods could communicate to them. And God did communicate to them through that method, and God revealed to them that it was Jonah. Now, they didn't know why God had sent the storm. So they asked Jonah, they're like, who are you? What did you do, right? And he talks about how he's a prophet, he's a Hebrew, he's a prophet of God, and they start panicking. They're thinking, okay, so it's the God of the Hebrews is doing this. And they say, what can we do to stop this, right? What can we do to appease your God? And of course, we know if Jonah was going away from God and God sent the storm, then if Jonah turned the ship around and said, let's go back, then God likely would have stopped the storm, because that was the intention of the storm, apparently. But Jonah decided, I'm not going that route. He said, throw me overboard, which is a death sentence. He said, if you throw me overboard, because he understood enough about God to know that God was not going to punish the sailors for his wrongdoing. He sent the storm for Jonah's sake. So if Jonah was gone, the sailors would be okay. So he says, throw me overboard. And again, we know, at least based on what the rest of the story reveals to us, that God just wanted Jonah to get back on track. He wanted Jonah to go to Nineveh like he had asked. So if Jonah had told the sailors, turn the ship around and everything will be okay, that would have likely happened. But instead he says, I'm not going to do what God told me to do. I would rather die than go do what God had told me to do. So if we believe that Jonah was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, or fleeing from going to Nineveh, the enemy country, because he was afraid, probably not, because he wasn't afraid of death, apparently, because that was he chose rather to do that than to do what God had told him to do. And after they throw him overboard into the sea, this raging sea, the storm stops, and they are amazed. And guess what they do? They worship the God of Jonah, and they start making a sacrifice to him, and they make vows to him. Now, I don't know if they turned away from their gods, but they did turn to the God of Jonah, right? And they made vows, which means they made commitments to him. So we can already see that Jonah, who doesn't want to be a missionary, right? He doesn't want to do what God wants him to do, but yet God used him as a missionary to these sailors. Right? God used the circumstances of a reluctant Jonah who didn't want anything to do with what God had called him to do, and God used him to witness to these pagan people, and they began to worship the God of Abraham. They began to make commitments to the God of Abraham. So already Jonah is being a very successful missionary, more successful than a lot of us. And Jonah, when he's in the sea, and if you read Jonah chapter 2, it's very poetic, but Jonah talks about this idea that he had died, basically. He says, I descended to the bottom of the mountains of the sea, to the roots of the mountains of the sea. Back then, it was believed that the sea, that it represented the place of the dead. And he says, I was at the gates of hell, which hell in Hebrew is Sheol. It means the place of the dead. He says, I was at the gates of death. The seaweed, it wrapped my body, almost like it's describing how he was being prepared for burial, and back then they used to wrap the bodies up before they would bury them. He says, the seaweed wrapped my body, and I said, I cried out from the deep, right? I cried out from the gates of death, and you heard me. And he's praying this prayer of thanksgiving because in the midst of his death, right, as he was dying, God sent a sea creature to actually save him. And the sea creature apparently swallowed him, and that can't be comfortable. I don't know how big this sea creature was, but unless it was the size of this building, you're probably very claustrophobic inside this thing. And I can only imagine the suffering of trying to be inside of this creature for 3 days, only getting oxygen when it would go up to get oxygen for itself. And so Jonah recognizes, though, that this is God's salvation for him, that God had rescued him, and he's praying and thanking God, and he says, God, I will do what you asked me to do. So the whale, or I don't know if it was a whale, the sea creature spits Jonah out, and this is what it says after that. And the word of the Lord came unto Jonah the second time, saying, Arise, go into Nineveh, that great city, and preach unto it the preaching that I bid thee. So Jonah's right back where he started from. And he does preach to Nineveh. He doesn't preach a very long message to Nineveh. It's just one sentence. 40 days, Nineveh will be destroyed. But Nineveh took that message very seriously, more seriously than Jonah took God's message. And Nineveh, all of them, from the least to the greatest, they all repented. In fact, they weren't even sure how to appease the God of Jonah, so they were starting to get their animals involved, saying the animals aren't allowed to eat either. We're all going to repent, put sackcloth and ashes on them too. And they were begged mightily unto God, saying, please, spare us. And God did spare them. So Jonah was one of the most successful missionaries in history. this was a highly populated city. In fact, God says multiple times, this is a great city. Not that it's great, like it's fantastic, but it's huge. And we know from Jonah chapter 4 that even when he was preaching God's word, he hated doing it, right? Once Nineveh repented, Jonah got angry because God wasn't punishing them. He said, oh, I knew you were going to do this, right? But yet God chose to use Jonah, this person who didn't even want to be used by God, and he still used him in a mighty way. God still used a willing Daniel. I told you guys already that the nation of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, once united under King David or King Saul even, was eventually divided into two nations. One was a northern nation, one was a southern nation. Jonah was a prophet to the northern nation. That nation, such a terrible nation, God decided, I'm done with you. He allowed Assyria, which by the way, Nineveh became the capital city of Assyria, and Nineveh, the king of Nineveh, came and defeated Israel, the northern nation, Jonah's nation, and ended up taking them into exile. So it's interesting that God used a repentant Nineveh who to actually enact his judgment against his people. But Judah, the southern tribe, or the southern nation, had actually survived for about 100 more years, and didn't necessarily, or sometimes it thrived. It had some good kings like Hezekiah and Josiah. But it survived for about 100 more years. But even then, God said, I'm going to send Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, to Judah to defeat it. And Nebuchadnezzar, remember Babylon, at the time when God was telling Jeremiah that, Babylon was owned by Assyria. Assyria was an empire at that time. Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar, he ends up taking back the city of Babylon and then gathering or rallying more troops and taking on Assyria and kind of partnering with another nation. And by the time Assyria fell, and then Egypt was just trying to protect this region because it had a lot of influence in that region. At the Battle of Carchemish, by the time Egypt fell, Nabopolassar had just died, and Nebuchadnezzar takes the throne, and then he comes back and marches on Judah and takes over Judah. And it says in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. And I don't know why I didn't put this in there, but the next verse says it was actually God who delivered Judah into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. So it wasn't Nebuchadnezzar defeated God's people. It was God gave his people into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. And it goes on to talk about how the king, he asked his chief eunuch, I want to gather some of the princes, some of the royalty of the people of Judah and of the other nations that I've conquered, and I want to bring them here, right? These are people who are going to have influence over their people, over their nation. I want them to be under my authority. I want them to be directly under me. So he gathers some of these children because he wants to kind of raise them and groom them to be his servants. And some of those included Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You may know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And God calls them here. And if you were to think back and put yourself in Daniel's shoes, if God had gone to Daniel and said, Daniel, here's what I'm thinking of doing, and give me your recommendation. Do you want me to, kill your family, your friends, destroy the temple and nation, so that you can be a missionary to Babylon? What do you think Daniel would have said? Probably not, right? Probably not something he would have preferred to do. But that was the situation that Daniel was in. Nebuchadnezzar came, destroyed the temple, destroyed Jerusalem. Many of Daniel's friends and family were likely perished, and those who didn't perish were taken into exile, with only a few remnants remaining in Judah, who still suffered in Judah, by the way. Jeremiah remained in Judah for a while until they seemed to kidnap him and take him to Egypt. But Daniel was likely going through a ton of suffering and pain, and he likely would not have chosen this if he had a choice. But since he was in that situation, he decided, no matter where I'm at, I'm going to be a light. I'm going to continue to be faithful to God. And God blessed him for that. And he became a light in Babylon and later in the Medo-Persian Empire. And where Nebuchadnezzar was so amazed with him that what God was doing with him, that he praised the God of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then later on, Babylon, it eventually falls, and Daniel's still alive. He's an old man by this point. And Darius, the king of the Medes, he's become really close friends with Daniel. And he promotes Daniel. He sees something different about Daniel. He says, I want you to be kind of the leader of all my counselors, like you're the president of all the counselors. And all the other counselors were kind of hateful towards Daniel. They didn't like that he was the favorite of King Darius. So they tried to trick King Darius, and they tricked him into signing a decree. And according to the Medo-Persian Empire's rules, once a decree is made, it cannot be undecreed, right? So they tricked Darius into making this decree where Daniel would have to choose between either worshiping Darius or worshiping God. And they knew Daniel was faithful to God, so they knew who Daniel would choose. And anyone who chose their God over Darius for a certain time period was going to be put into a lion's den. And so Daniel, he continued to be faithful where he was at, and they were able to use that to their advantage to try to get Daniel in trouble. And when Darius heard about it, he was so upset about it, and he was hoping and praying that maybe, just maybe, this God of Daniel would protect him in the lion's den. So the next morning, he comes to the lion's den, and he cries out to Daniel and says, "Are you still alive? Did your God save you?" And Daniel says, "Yes, my God did save me." And of course, it's pretty pointless to keep him down there if the lions aren't going to eat him. So he brings them up out of the lion's den, and he throws all the other counselors in there, the ones who tricked him. He throws them in the lion's den, and the lions immediately eat them up. Why? Because they're lions, right? They're hungry lions. Some people could say, well, maybe the lions were just not that hungry at that time. Well, apparently they were very hungry, and they ate them all up. And Darius decrees something. Listen to this. "And the king Darius wrote unto all people, nations, and languages." Now, this may have been specifically in his empire, which was very vast, but it's possible that he even sent it out further than that, in language that dwell in all the earth. "Peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom," which again was vast, "men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and steadfast forever. In his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end." So you see, we look at the time of the exile where people like Daniel and other people were taken out of Judah after it had been destroyed and taken into a foreign land where they're surrounded by these false gods or these false idols and these people who don't respect the God of Israel or the God of Judah. And we think this is such a tragedy, and certainly it was. It was God's way of disciplining them. But we also need to recognize that God did something great. When God was speaking to Moses, he says, "I want my people, Israel, to be my representatives," right? To be my priests, my representatives to the world. And they weren't doing that, right? If anything, the world was being a representative to them, right? They were following the world, and yet God used Daniel during the exile, the circumstances, to where Darius and also Nebuchadnezzar at a different time, they proclaimed throughout their entire empire. More people would have heard about God in that time than any other time in the world, and it was through the faithfulness of one willing missionary. Not a missionary who wanted to be in Babylon or Persia or wherever Daniel was throughout his life, but a missionary who was at least willing to follow God wherever he was at. So Daniel did suffer. Jonah suffered, but for very different reasons, right? All right, finally, God still used a pursuing Jesus. Now, the story of the woman at the well, we're actually going to, in my series, I'd planned on talking about it already, so we're not going to go into too much detail on this. Because we're going to talk about it in a future sermon. But the woman at the well, basically the Samaritans and the Jews, they didn't like each other. The Jews, after the exile, they were allowed to go back to Jerusalem, so they're living there. But Samaria was actually the capital city of the northern nation, right? The northern nation of Israel, which had been destroyed by Assyria. And the people of the land, the Israelites, had been exiled. And the Assyrian king had actually replaced them with another people group. And this other people group, the Bible records that they actually, they worshiped their own gods, and the God of Israel was upset. So he plagued them with something very interesting. It wasn't measles or something like that. It was lions, right? He plagued them with lions. And they recognized there are so many lions here, this must be a God thing. So they actually decide to send priests back to Israel. The king of Assyria decided to send priests back to Israel to teach the people how to worship the God of the land, so the God of Abraham, how to worship him. Now, there may have been some people, some Israelites who remained in the land of Israel who these foreigners had intermingled with, but all we know that by the time of Jesus, there were still people in Samaria. Were they Jewish? Were they kind of a mixture of Jewish and these other foreigners who had come in hundreds of years before? Whoever they were, they believed in God, right? They had their own temple to God. They believed in the first 5 books of the Bible. It was a little different than the Jewish version, but one thing was for certain: they hated the Jews and the Jews hated them. There was constant hostility towards them. Josephus, a Jewish historian, he writes about how the Samaritans, they would associate with the Jews only when it was convenient, right? If the Jews were prospering, the Samaritans, they'd say, yeah, we're Jewish too, and they'd prosper with them. If the Jews were being punished, they'd say, oh, we don't have anything to do with them. We don't know them, right? We're not Jewish. So there was a lot of hostility towards them. So when Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan, it was supposed to be a shock to the people. Wait, a Samaritan good, right? These were people that they hated. And a Samaritan showing more love towards an Israelite than a priest or a Levite. So when John, in the book of John, when he tells the story of the Samaritan woman, this would have been a shock to his readers, right? So God, or Jesus, he comes to a city of Samaria. A lot of people, they'd go around Samaria, these cities, because they don't want anything to do with them. But Jesus, he apparently had told his disciples, we're going through it, and he sat outside the city while his disciples went in to go grab some food for him. And he's sitting by a well, and this woman comes to the well. She's Samaritan, and Jesus asked her, can you get me some water too? Because, right, they don't just leave cups there, I guess. He's like, you've got a pot, can you bring me some water too? And she says, why are you talking to me, right? You're Jewish, I'm Samaritan. And she starts questioning Jesus, but Jesus is not so concerned about the rivalries between the Jewish and the Samaritan nation. I remember when I moved to Kansas, who's the rival of Cheney? Does anyone know? Garden Plain. Not to me, right? I wasn't born here. I don't know that. So when I moved here, even in our youth group, I don't think there was a single Garden Plain person in our youth group. There is now, by the way. We're very inclusive now. But at the time, it was just, we don't get along, right? Football time came, Cheney lost every game. All right, now it's kind of flipped. But at the time, there was such a rivalry. And for me, when I came here, I'm like, that doesn't matter to me. I don't have any rivalry with Garden Plain. But Jesus was the same way. Not that I'm like Jesus, though we're supposed to be. Jesus looked at this rivalry between the Jewish and the Samaritans, and he didn't care about it. That wasn't his concern. That wasn't his purpose. He was witnessing to the Samaritan woman, and as she was trying to say, well, what about where we worship? Is it the right place to worship, or do we have to worship in Jerusalem? Or what about the Messiah when he comes? And all these different questions, and Jesus was staying focused, and he talked to her about, he is actually the living water. He doesn't say any Jew who wants to drink of the living water that I provide. He says, no, anyone, right? Whosoever. He said, whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again, talking about the water at the well. But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be unto him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. And it talks about his disciples. They come to him and they see him talking to this Samaritan woman, and they're thinking, this is weird, right? Why is he talking to her? And it may have been for several reasons. One, he was considered a rabbi, a teacher, and rabbis usually didn't talk to women unless they were married to them, and maybe not even then. But then not only that, but she was a Samaritan. So they're thinking, why is our teacher, a Jewish teacher, talking to a Samaritan woman? And they're a little confused by it, but they're like, okay, he's in charge, whatever he wants. And then let's see what it says going on. No man said, what seekest thou, or why talkest thou with her, right? They understood he's the boss. In the meanwhile, his disciples prayed him, saying, Master, eat, right? They went to go get him some food. But he said unto them, I have meat to eat that ye know not of. Therefore said the disciples one to another, hath any man brought him aught to eat? Right? They're confused. They're thinking, we went to the city to go get him some food. We come back and he says, I had food that you didn't know about. And they're like, who gave him food, right? And he says something very interesting. Jesus saith unto them, my meat excuse me, my meat is to do the will of him that sent me and to finish his work. And of course, Jesus isn't talking about physical food, but he's using it as an analogy to say, just as humans, we have a hunger to eat food, a hunger that can't be satisfied until we actually participate in eating. He says, I have a hunger to do the will of my Father. And when I do the will of my Father, only then can I find that satisfaction. Right? I love eating. Fasting is one of the hardest things, hardest disciplines for me. Fasting feels like death to me. I think once you get past the first couple of days, it gets a little easier. But yeah, the first day, you're just like, well, I guess this is the end. The second day, you're like, well, I guess the end is prolonged. But then by the third day, you're like, I'm not even hungry anymore. But then you start eating again eventually, hopefully. Otherwise, you will die. But Jesus talks about this idea that just as you feel this craving for food, has anyone ever been so hungry? I mean, we've all been so hungry. I'm not even going to ask that. We've all been so hungry where we feel this emptiness in our stomach. Well, that's what Jesus was saying. He says, I have such a desire, such a heart, such a need to do the will of my Father that I cannot be satisfied until I do it. You see, I guess we can go, we'll talk about this first. Jonah didn't want to do the will of the Father. Daniel was willing to do the will of the Father. Jesus actively pursued the will of the Father. Jonah, by God's grace, was able to reach the sailors as well as the entire city of Nineveh, even as an unwilling participant. Daniel, as a willing participant, still by the grace of God, was able to reach an entire empire of people. Jesus, also by the grace of God, was pursuing God's will and was able to reach an entire world, an entire universe, if you will, generation after generation for God. So 3 different missionaries, 3 different desires, I suppose you could say, and 3 different outcomes. And as I was going through this sermon, a passage that came to mind came from, I believe it's 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2, 19 through 20, as well as 3, 17 through 18. For time's sake, we'll talk about this one. They're very similar. Peter says, for it is better, if the will of God be so, that ye suffer for well-doing than for evil-doing. For Christ also hath once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God. Right? Excuse me. This idea that we're all going to suffer, right? We're all going to go through pain in this life. There's no one who hasn't gone through pain. Even a baby gets spanked, right? Don't spank your babies. I'm saying when they're born, right? Right, okay. Right. This idea that every baby, I always often say that I know why babies cry. They're suffering the most pain they've ever suffered before, right? Because they're new to this thing. I think I tell babies when I see them, I say, it's only going to get worse. Right? We all go through suffering. But Peter says, it's better to suffer for doing the right thing than to suffer for doing the wrong thing. I don't remember, it may be the passage above, and maybe even a different passage or book altogether. But there's this idea that if we're punished for doing the wrong thing, great, that's what we deserve. But when we're punished for doing the right thing, right, we have a reward in heaven for that. And Jonah, I think of the story of Jonah. Jonah went through suffering. Daniel went through suffering. Jesus went through suffering, but all for very different reasons. In Jonah's case, he suffered because he was going against God. We see the success of Jonah, which is very successful, more successful than almost any other prophet in the Bible. And yet we look at that story and we think, wow, Jonah's a piece of work, right? That guy, he was going against God the entire time, and he suffered for it. And we don't sympathize with Jonah's suffering, right? But then you read the story of Daniel, and you're like, okay, what did Daniel do to endure so much suffering? Well, Daniel was just part of a nation, a wicked nation. Not that Daniel himself, though we're all wicked to some extent, but Daniel suffered because of the judgment against a wicked nation. And yet, in the midst of that, he still chose to follow God, and God blessed him for it. In fact, many times when him and his 3 friends, they were about to die for their faithfulness to God, God protected them. That doesn't happen every time, right? There are people all over the world who pass away following Christ. But in Daniel's case, at least, he was protected. But we do know that Daniel suffered traumatic experiences, but also loss. loss of his country, loss of maybe his family, his friends. So Daniel did suffer, but not for doing something wrong, but because other people had done something wrong, and God was punishing the nation for it. And we look back at Daniel as a much more respectable person than we look at Jonah, right? And then we look at Jesus, and Jesus suffered, but not for the same reason, or kind of for the same reasons. Jesus didn't do anything wrong, but yet his purpose for suffering was to save the same people who were causing his suffering. He intentionally pursued suffering, knowing that it would lead to something greater. And the reason why I bring this up, and kind of as to the conclusion, every Christian should seek to pursue God's will and missions based on these three examples, right? You may be like Jonah, reluctant. You may feel God tugging you and saying, you know what? I want you to go do a certain thing. Maybe it is go to the mission field. That would be great. But the truth is, we don't want to be inconvenienced, much less suffer, right? So often we try to avoid God. We try to tune him out. As Rachel was saying today, we put our phones on silent, right? We don't want to hear the notifications from God in our soul, if you will. We just want to tune it all out and say, you know what? I'm living my best life. God, you're just going to have to deal with it, right? We run from the presence of God, or at least we hide from it, just like Jonah did. There are others who they decide, I'm going to witness to God right where I'm at, like Daniel did. Now, Daniel was, of course, taken to a foreign land, and you may not be taken to a foreign land, but God can still use you right where you're at. In Cheney, Garden Plain, Goddard, Kingman, Hutchinson, wherever your town is, wherever God leads you, God can use you wherever you are at. And you may lose your job, for example, and you may think, this is terrible, I'm going to have to relocate. Maybe you have a job who relocates you, saying you're either going to get fired or you're going to have to move. And you think, this is terrible news. And like Daniel, you have to go where someone else has decided to send you. But even there, God can use you as a witness. Or are you going to be like Jesus and actively look for where God wants to use you, right? Is God's will in your life so ingrained in your heart that you feel this deep pit in your stomach when you're not doing the will of God? So again, three different people suffered for different reasons, but God still used all of them. And God's going to use you. Now, you may go through some suffering if you're resisting God, but wouldn't it be so much greater if we could pursue his will rather than resist his will? Does that make sense? All right, absolutely. Let's go ahead and pray. Dear God, I want to thank you for this day. Lord, the truth is, there are people in this room who could go in the field. In fact, I suppose any of us could go in the field, the mission field, Lord. But Lord, show us where that field is. Is it next door, our neighbors? Is it in another city? Is it in another state? Is it in another country? Is it to another culture, Lord? Lord, we pray that you would show us your will. I remember Brother Bob asking someone years and years ago a question about going on the mission field, and he was joking, Lord, and you know the situation I'm thinking of. But something they said really stood out to me. Lord, they said, maybe in a different life. And I think to myself, this is the only life I can give you. Lord, if you're calling me, if you're calling someone here to your field, whatever it may be, Lord, please use us. Please give us a heart that is not just willing like Daniel, though Daniel's awesome, but a heart like Jesus that desires to pursue your will, that desires to go where you lead us. Lord, give us that heart.